Hello, today Alaica will tell you a short social psychology story called So Shocking Sold Wife to Best Friend. Let's explore this story with Alaica. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Alaica. I never thought my life would come to this. A marriage not born of love, but of necessity. As I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the delicate lace of my wedding dress, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision I had made. The reflection staring back at me was a stranger, a woman who had traded her dreams for survival. My heart was heavy, but my mind was resolute. This was the only way. The knock on the door startled me. "Julia, it's time," my sister whispered softly. Her eyes were filled with concern, but she didn't say anything more. She knew why I was doing this. Everyone did. My family's business was crumbling, debts piling up faster than we could handle. And then came the offer, an arrangement that would save us all. But at a cost I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the room, my heels clicking against the marble floor. The grand hall was filled with people, their eyes turning toward me as I walked down the aisle. At the end of it stood him, Adrian. Tall, composed, and impossibly handsome. He looked every bit the part of a man who had everything under control. But I knew better. This wasn't his choice either. His family needed this union as much as mine did. And we were both pawns in a game far bigger than ourselves. As I reached him, Adrian extended his hand. His touch was firm, steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Resentment, perhaps, or maybe resignation. I couldn't tell. The priest began the ceremony, his voice a distant hum as my thoughts spiraled. Was this really my life now? A life bound to a man I barely knew, tied together by contracts and obligations rather than love. "Do you, Julia, take Adrian to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the priest asked, his voice cutting through my haze. I hesitated, just for a moment, before nodding. "I do," I said, my voice steady, despite the storm raging inside me. Adrian's response was just as measured. "I do," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. The room erupted in applause as we were pronounced husband and wife. But all I could hear was the deafening silence between us. He leaned in, his lips brushing against my cheek in a gesture that felt more like a formality than affection. The reception was a blur of forced smiles and polite conversations. Adrian and I played our roles perfectly, the picture of a happy couple. But when the crowd thinned and the night grew quiet, the reality of our situation settled in. We were alone now, two strangers bound by a promise neither of us wanted to make. "I suppose we should talk, yeah," Adria said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a hint of frustration he couldn't quite hide. "Yes," I replied, meeting his gaze. "We should." And in that moment, I realized that this was only the beginning. A marriage of convenience, yes, but one that would test us in ways neither of us could have anticipated. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to doubt her husband. Ethan had always been my rock, steady, dependable, and the man I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. But lately, something had shifted. It was subtle at first. The late nights at work, the hurried phone calls he'd take in the other room, the way he avoided my eyes when I asked him simple questions. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening. Ethan had promised to be home for dinner. But as the hours ticked by, the food grew cold, and my patience wore thin. I sat at the table, staring at the empty chair across from me, my mind racing with possibilities. When he finally walked through the door, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He froze, his hand still on the doorknob, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt. "Work ran late," he said, his tone too casual, too rehearsed. He avoided my gaze as he shrugged off his coat. But I wasn't buying it. Not this time. "Don't lie to me, Ethan," I said, standing up. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I know something's going on. Just tell me the truth." He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You're being ridiculous, Julia. There's nothing to tell." But his words only fueled my anger. "Don't you dare gaslight me," I snapped. "I've seen the way you've been acting. The late nights, the secretive phone calls. Do you think I'm blind?" Ethan's face hardened, and for a moment, I thought he might deny it again. But then, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "You want the truth? There is someone else." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. "How long?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Does it matter?" he replied, his tone cold, detached. "It's not like we've been happy, Julia. You know that as well as I do." His words cut deeper than I thought possible. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw something, but all I could do was stand there, frozen in place. "So that's it?" I said finally, my voice trembling. "You just decided to throw everything away without even trying to fix it." Ethan didn't answer. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable before turning and walking out of the room. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed in the silence, and I felt my knees give out as I sank to the floor. I sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of his betrayal pressing down on me. I had loved him, trusted him, and now everything we had built together was crumbling around me. But as the tears finally came, I realized something. I deserved better. And no matter how much it hurt, I would find a way to move forward without him. I could feel the tension in the air the moment I stepped into Ethan's office. The usually pristine space was in disarray, papers scattered across the desk, his tie loosened and his face buried in his hands. Ethan, the man who always seemed unshakable, looked like he was on the verge of breaking. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should even be there. But the weight of the situation pulled me forward. "Ethan," I said softly, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with something I hadn't seen in years. Fear. "Julia," he said, his voice hoarse, "I didn't expect you to come." "I heard," I replied, stepping closer. "The company, it's all over the news. What's going on?" He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "What's going on? Everything is falling apart, that's what. The investors are pulling out. The board is panicking and He stopped, his voice cracking. I don't know how to fix this. I had never seen him like this before. Ethan was always the one with the answers, the one who thrived under pressure. But now, he looked like a man drowning, and it terrified me. Start from the beginning, I said, sitting down across from him. Tell me everything. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. It started months ago, he admitted. The market shifted, and we weren't prepared. I thought we could recover, but then the numbers kept dropping. I tried to hide it, to buy us time, but now it's too late. The company is on the brink of bankruptcy. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Ethan's company wasn't just his livelihood. It was his identity, the thing he had poured his heart and soul into for years. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice trembling. Why did you try to handle this alone? Because I didn't want you to see me like this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want you to know I was failing. I felt a surge of anger and sadness all at once. Ethan, you don't have to do this alone. We're supposed to be a team, remember? You should have trusted me. He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. I know, he said. But I've made so many mistakes, Julia. Not just with the company, with us. I don't even know if I can fix any of it. His words hung in the air, heavy and raw. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let him deal with the mess he had created. But another part of me, the part that still cared despite everything, couldn't leave him like this. We'll figure it out, I said finally, my voice steady. But you have to let me in, Ethan. No more secrets, no more lies. If we're going to get through this, we have to do it together. He nodded, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. Together, he repeated, as if testing the word. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about saving his company. It was about saving us. I didn't expect to meet anyone that night. I had gone to the gallery opening to escape, to lose myself in the art and the quiet hum of strangers' conversations. My life had been a whirlwind of chaos lately. Ethan's betrayal, his company's collapse, and the weight of everything I had been carrying alone. I needed a moment to breathe, to feel like myself again. But then, I saw him, Lucas. He was standing near a large, abstract painting, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. There was something about him that drew me in immediately. Maybe it was the way he seemed so at ease, so unaffected by the crowd around him. Or maybe it was the quiet intensity in his eyes, as if he saw the world differently than everyone else. Whatever it was, I couldn't look away. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the noise of the room faded. He smiled, a small knowing smile that made my heart skip a beat. I hesitated, unsure if I should approach him, but before I could decide, he was already walking toward me. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, nodding toward the painting. His voice was warm, smooth, and it wrapped around me like a comforting embrace. It is, I replied, though I wasn't sure if I was talking about the painting or him. There's something raw about it, like it's trying to say something, but you can't quite figure out what. He tilted his head, studying me for a moment. That's the beauty of it, isn't it? The mystery, the way it makes you feel something, even if you don't fully understand it. I nodded, feeling an unexpected connection to his words. I guess that's true for a lot of things in life. His smile deepened, and for a moment, I forgot about everything else. The weight of my problems, the pain of Ethan's betrayal. It all seemed to fade in his presence. "I'm Lucas," he said, extending his hand. "Julia," I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm, steady, and I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. We spent the rest of the evening talking, moving from one painting to the next. Lucas had a way of making me feel seen, like he wasn't just listening to my words, but understanding the emotions behind them. He asked questions that no one else had thought to ask, and for the first time in months, I found myself opening up. As the night wore on, I realized how much I had missed this. Connection, conversation, the feeling of being truly alive. Lucas wasn't just a distraction. He was a reminder of what I had been missing, of what I deserved. When the gallery began to empty, he turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "Can I see you again, Julia?" I hesitated, the weight of my past threatening to pull me back. But then I thought about everything I had been through, everything I had survived. Maybe it was time to take a chance, to let myself feel something new. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I'd like that." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt hope. I didn't expect Lucas to become such a constant in my life. What started as a chance meeting at the gallery had grown into something I couldn't quite define, but I felt it. Stronger with every passing day. He had a way of making me feel seen, as if he could look past the walls I had built and see the person I was trying so hard to protect. It terrified me, but it also made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. We spent hours together, talking about everything and nothing. Lucas had this quiet intensity about him, a way of listening that made me feel like my words mattered. He didn't push, didn't demand more than I was ready to tell me, but his presence alone was enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about myself. One evening, ere we sat on a park bench overlooking the city, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Julia," he said softly, "you've been through so much. I can see it in your eyes, but you don't have to carry it all alone." His words hit me harder than I expected. I looked away, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. "It's not that simple," I murmured. "There's so much I haven't told you." "Then tell me," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "I'm here, Julia. I'm not going anywhere." I wanted to believe him, but the scars of my past were still fresh. Ethan's betrayal, the collapse of our marriage, the weight of his company's failure. It all felt like too much to unload on someone who had only just stepped into my life. But Lucas's eyes held a kind of patience I wasn't used to, and for the first time I felt the urge to let someone in. "I was married," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "to a man who wasn't who I thought he was. He lied to me, betrayed me, and when everything fell apart, I was left to pick up the pieces alone." Lucas didn't interrupt, didn't try to fill the silence that followed. He just waited, his gaze steady, as if he knew there was more I needed to say. "I thought I'd never trust anyone again," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But then you came along and, I don't know, You make me feel like maybe it's okay to hope again." He reached for my hand, his touch warm and grounding. "It is okay," he said firmly. "You deserve to hope, Julia. You deserve to be happy." Tears welled in my eyes. But for once, they weren't from pain. They were from the overwhelming relief of being understood, of being seen. I squeezed his hand, a small but significant gesture, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. As the city lights twinkled in the distance, I realized that my connection with Lucas wasn't just growing, it was changing me. And maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what I needed to heal. I never thought betrayal could feel so sharp, so visceral, like a knife twisting in my chest. But as I stood there, staring at the damning evidence in my hands, I realized that Ethan's lies had cut deeper than I ever imagined. The photos, the receipts, the messages, they were all there, laid out in front of me like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. My hands trembled as I clutched the papers, my mind racing to make sense of it all. How long had this been going on? How many times had he looked me in the eye and lied? I thought back to the late nights, the whispered phone calls, the way he had grown distant, cold. I had ignored the signs, convinced myself that I was overthinking, that I was being paranoid. But now, the truth was staring me in the face, and there was no denying it. The door creaked open behind me, and I turned to see Ethan standing there, his expression shifting from surprise to something darker. "Guilt." "Julia," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "I can explain." "Explain?" I spat, my voice shaking with anger. "Explain what, Ethan? That you've been lying to me, that you've been sneaking around behind my back? How do you even begin to explain this?" He took a step toward me, his hands raised as if to calm me. "It's not what it looks like," he said, but the words felt hollow, empty. I could see the panic in his eyes, the way he was scrambling to find an excuse, a way out. "Don't you dare insult my intelligence," I snapped, holding up the papers. "I have proof, Ethan. Proof of everything. So don't stand there and try to deny it." He froze, his jaw tightening. For a moment, I thought he might try to fight back, to argue. But then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a heavy sigh. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been lying. I've made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You call this a mistake? You didn't just trip and fall into someone else's bed, Ethan. You made a choice. Over and over again, you chose to betray me." The room was silent except for the sound of my ragged breathing. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was lost, Julia. The company, the pressure, it was all too much. I didn't know how to handle it. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "So, you decided to destroy the one thing you had left? The one person who stood by you through everything? That's your excuse?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, his head bowed, as if he couldn't bear to face me. And in that moment, I realized that the man I had once loved was gone, replaced by a stranger I no longer recognized. I took a deep breath, the weight of his betrayal settling over me like a heavy cloak. "We're done, Ethan," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You've taken everything from me, but I won't let you take my dignity." And with that, I walked out, leaving him behind. The pain was overwhelming, but I knew I had made the right choice. It was time to start over, to rebuild my life without him. The air felt different that morning, crisp, clean, and full of possibility. For the first time in what felt like forever, I woke up without the weight of Ethan's betrayal pressing down on my chest. The past few months had been a whirlwind of pain, anger, and self-discovery. But now, as I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope. This was my fresh start, my chance to rebuild. The apartment was small, modest, compared to the house Ethan and I had shared, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall, every detail reflected me. Not the version of myself I had been with Ethan, but the woman I was becoming. Stronger, braver, and unafraid to take control of her own life. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands as I thought about everything that had brought me here. Ethan's lies had shattered me, but they had also forced me to confront truths I had been avoiding for years. I had spent so much of my life trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect partner, that I had lost sight of who I was. Now, I was finally learning to put myself first. My phone buzzed on the table, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from Lucas. Just seeing his name brought a smile to my face. He had been my anchor through the storm, a steady presence when everything else felt like it was falling apart. But more than that, he had reminded me what it felt like to be seen, to be valued for who I was, not for what I could give. "Good morning, Julia. How's the new place? Let me know if you need help unpacking. I'm just a call away." I couldn't help but laugh softly. Lucas had a way of making even the simplest messages feel like a lifeline. I typed back quickly. "Good morning. The place is great, but I might take you up on that offer. I could use a hand with the bookshelves." His reply came almost instantly. "Say no more. I'll be there this afternoon." I set the phone down, my heart lighter than it had been in months. Lucas wasn't just a distraction from the pain of my past. He was becoming a part of my future. But this time, I wasn't rushing into anything. I was learning to take things one step at a time, to trust myself and my instincts. As the day unfolded, I found myself smiling more, laughing more, and feeling a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. When Lucas arrived later that afternoon, carrying a toolbox and wearing that easy smile of his, I realized something. This wasn't just a new beginning. It was a chance to rewrite my story, to create a life that was entirely my own. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready. Life has a way of testing you when you least expect it. Just when I thought I had found my footing, the universe threw me another curveball. The new job I had worked so hard to secure came with challenges I hadn't anticipated. Long hours, impossible deadlines, and a boss who seemed determined to push me to my breaking point. There were nights I came home exhausted, questioning if I had made the right choice in starting over. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of how far I had come. I wasn't the same woman who had let Ethan's betrayal define her. I was stronger now, and I wasn't going to let anything or anyone hold me back. Lucas was my rock through it all, He had a way of grounding me, of reminding me why I had chosen this path in the first place. On the nights when I felt like giving up, he would show up at my door with takeout and a bottle of wine, his easy smile melting away the stress of the day. "You've got this, Julia," he would say, his voice steady and full of conviction. And somehow, I believed him. But it wasn't just work that tested me. My past had a way of creeping back in when I least expected it. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I saw Ethan waiting for me by the entrance. My heart sank, a mix of anger and unease washing over me. I hadn't seen him since the day I walked out, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face him now. "Julia," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, every instinct telling me to walk away. But something in his eyes stopped me. He looked different. Not the confident, self-assured man I had once known, but someone who had been humbled by his mistakes. Against my better judgment, I nodded. We sat on a bench outside, the city bustling around us. Ethan apologized, truly apologized, for everything he had done. He admitted to his failures, his selfishness, and the pain he had caused. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I needed you to know that I'm sorry." Hearing those words brought a strange sense of closure. I didn't forgive him, not entirely, but I realized I no longer needed to carry the weight of his betrayal. I had moved on, and I was finally free. That night, as I sat with Lucas on my balcony, I told him about the encounter. He listened without judgment, his hand warm and steady in mine. "You've come so far, Julia," he said, his voice filled with pride. "And no matter what happens, I'll be here." Looking out at the city lights, I felt a sense of triumph I hadn't thought possible. The challenges I had faced hadn't broken me. They had shaped me into someone stronger, someone who was finally ready to embrace the life she deserved. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson as I stood on the balcony of my apartment. The city stretched out before me, alive with its endless hum, but for the first time in years, I felt at peace. This was my life now, one I had fought for, one I had rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal and heartbreak. And as I stood there, I realized just how far I had come. Lucas stepped out onto the balcony, his presence as steady and comforting as ever. He carried 2 glasses of wine, handing one to me with that easy smile that had become my anchor. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice soft. "What's on your mind?" I took a sip of the wine, letting the warmth spread through me. "Just everything," I admitted. "How much has changed? How much I've changed." He leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on me. "You've been through hell, Julia, but you didn't let it break you. You're stronger than you know." His words brought a lump to my own throat. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who had clung to a broken marriage, who had let fear and doubt dictate her choices. That woman felt like a stranger now. I had faced my demons, confronted my past, and found the courage to start over. And in doing so, I had found something I never thought I would again: happiness. Lucas reached for my hand, his touch warm and grounding. "I have something for you," he said, his voice tinged with nervousness. My heart skipped a beat as he pulled a small box from his pocket. "Lucas," I whispered, my voice trembling. He opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "Julia, you've shown me what it means to love, to trust, to believe in something bigger than ourselves. I don't want to imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in my eyes as I looked at him. This man who had walked into my life when I was at my lowest and helped me find my way back to myself. "Yes," I said, my voice breaking. "Yes, Lucas, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and in that moment, the world seemed to fade away. It was just us, standing on that balcony, the city lights twinkling below as if celebrating with us. Later that night, as we sat together on the couch, his arms wrapped around me, I thought about everything that had led me here. The pain, the heartbreak, the challenges, they had all been part of the journey. And while I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone, I knew it had shaped me into the woman I was now. This was my happy ending, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. I had found love, yes, but more importantly, I had found myself. And for the first time in my life, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be.